Before the galaxy burned, there was only belief. Before betrayal, there was trust. And before Horus became the name that cursed 10,000 worlds, he was the one man the Emperor called son without hesitation. They said the Emperor saw all things, every strand of fate, every storm in the warp, every lie men told themselves to endure. Yet when he looked upon Horus Lupercal, War Master of the Imperium, his vision did not show damnation. It showed potential, the promise of a new age where mankind would no longer crawl among the stars but walk as gods. The Emperor saw in Horus not rebellion but reflection, the mirror of his own impossible dream, and that was his first mistake. For in the end, it was not the darkness of chaos that destroyed the War Master. It was the light of faith, the belief of a father that his son could never fall. If you have ever wondered what broke the bond between the two greatest beings mankind ever produced, stay with me through this story. Because this isn't just a tale of war. It's a story of trust, of pride, and of the one vision the Emperor refused to see. Strengthen this signal. Like, share, and subscribe, and join the vigil. Let the truth of the War Master's fall echo one last time, before the silence takes it again. Before he was the War Master, before he was the arch-traitor, before his name became a curse whispered by terrified chaplains in ruined cathedrals, Horus was simply the first. The first Primarch found, the first to kneel before the Emperor of mankind and see not a god but a father. And in that kneeling, the future of the Imperium was born. The world of Chthoniya was a pit carved from violence. Its cities lay buried beneath rock and steel, ruled by gangs that worshipped power as the only law that ever lasted. When the Emperor descended upon that hollow world, his arrival was not heralded by thunder or celestial song. He came like a quiet storm, golden and calm, surrounded by the custodes whose armor reflected the light of his will. The underworld fell silent before him, not from fear but recognition. Even before the Emperor spoke, they knew they were in the presence of something absolute. From the darkness stepped Horus, young, scarred, and already carrying the weight of command in his gaze. The gangs had followed him, united for the first time under one banner not of desperation but destiny. When their eyes met, the Emperor did not see a weapon or a tool. He saw understanding. For the first time since he had begun the search for his lost sons, he looked upon a being who did not need explanation. Horus did not ask what the Emperor was. He only asked what needed to be done. It is said that in that instant the Emperor smiled, not the divine smile depicted in frescoes across the Imperium, but something smaller, human. A father seeing in his child the reflection of what he once hoped to be. That was what he saw in Horus first. Not perfection, but promise. A soul capable of wielding love and cruelty with equal precision, as all leaders must. And for a time, that promise was fulfilled beyond measure. Through the early years of the Great Crusade, Horus became the Emperor's shadow and his sword. Every victory, every world brought to compliance carried the mark of his command. He fought not for glory, but for the dream his father had shown him. A galaxy united under reason, not superstition. When the Emperor spoke of illumination, Horus understood that light was meaningless without the darkness it revealed. Together they were architects of a future that had no room for gods. Ironically, that was when men began to worship them most. To the legions, Horus was more than commander. He was proof that perfection could walk among them. To the Emperor, he was the bridge between vision and reality, the one being who could interpret divinity as duty, not faith. The bond between them was not one of obedience, but of mutual recognition. They did not need words to understand one another. A glance across a battlefield carried volumes. The Emperor saw in his son a reflection so flawless that he began, for the first time, to trust. And in that trust, a quiet blindness began to bloom. The other Primarchs saw it too. Leman Russ spoke of Horus with grudging respect, Rogaldorn with disciplined envy. Even Magnus the Red, who read the warp like scripture, warned his father that no mortal, not even a Primarch, could bear the full weight of the Emperor's faith. The Emperor listened but said nothing. His silence was absolute, and in that silence Horus heard only approval. Every triumph became affirmation. Every failure a test. To disappoint the Emperor was unthinkable because to Horus, the Emperor's belief was the only truth that mattered. On the world of Ulanor, after the greatest victory of the Crusade, The emperor stood before billions and named Horus Warmaster. The title was both gift and curse. In front of the legions, the emperor's words were pure radiance, a father's pride made manifest. Yet behind that light hid something unseen: delegation. For the first time, the emperor stepped back. For the first time, Horus stood alone. That night, beneath the alien stars of Ulanor, the emperor walked the quiet fields beyond the celebration grounds. The air shimmered with the heat of dying pyres, and the scent of burnt promethium lingered like incense. Horus followed him there, his armor unfastened, his face unguarded. They spoke without rank. "Father," Horus said, "when you look at me, what do you see?" The emperor turned to him, the light of his armor fading to a dull glow. "I see what I was meant to be," he replied, "and what I must one day overcome." It was the closest thing to prophecy the emperor ever spoke. Horus bowed his head, not understanding. He thought his father meant humility, that to overcome him was to lead. But what the emperor saw in that moment was something neither of them could admit: the reflection of his own flaw, magnified by love. For the greatest danger to divinity is not defiance, it is resemblance. When the emperor returned to Terra soon after, leaving Horus in command of the crusade, the Warmaster watched his father's ship ascend into the night. For the first time, he felt distance. The stars that had once seemed united beneath their will now felt immeasurably vast. The bond between them, stretched by duty, trembled under the strain of separation. In that space between trust and silence, something unseen began to whisper. It would take years before Horus heard it clearly. But it began here, in the pause between a father's vision and a son's need to be seen. The void swallowed the Emperor's fleet as it departed Ulanor, leaving only the echoes of its engines in the thin air. Horus stood alone upon the platform where his father's last light had faded. Around him, the banners of victory still rippled in the wind, symbols of unity, of conquest, of everything the Great Crusade promised. Yet to Horus, they suddenly felt like relics of a moment already gone. For the first time, the galaxy felt larger than his father's shadow. For the first time, he felt the weight of command not as an honor, but as inheritance. He turned his eyes toward the stars and saw what every Primarch feared to admit: that the Emperor's absence did not leave silence. But space, and in that space thought began to echo. The legions that once obeyed a single will now looked to him. Billions of lives moved at his gesture. Every victory, every planet brought to compliance bore his name first and the Emperor's second. At first that thought frightened him. Then it began to please him. The Great Crusade entered a new rhythm. Horus led with the same brilliance that had earned him his father's trust, but now his decisions carried a sharper edge. He demanded perfection because perfection was the only language he and his father had ever shared. His warriors followed with reverent zeal. They believed that through him the Emperor still spoke. Horus believed it too, until the silence lasted too long. On the world of Arrhenius Prime, after a campaign that had devoured 10,000 lives, he stood before the Compliance Council, reading the message transmitted from Terra. It was brief, impersonal, written by the sigil of the sigillite rather than the Emperor himself. A directive to divert forces toward the eastern fringe, no acknowledgement of victory, no word of pride or recognition. For Horus, the ink burned worse than any wound. He crushed the data slate in his hand until it cracked. "Is this all I am to him?" he murmured. A voice to be turned off when not needed? His captain said nothing. None dared to. They saw in his face the reflection of something they could not name, a crack forming in the marble of faith. That night, as the fleet prepared to leave orbit, Horus visited the Strategium alone. The stars shifted across the hololithic display like living symbols, each one representing a conquered system, a subjugated world. He thought of the Emperor's dream, unity through illumination, and realized how little of it he had ever truly understood. His father's brilliance had always hidden the edges of that dream, as though light itself were a veil. What had the Emperor seen in him really? A weapon, a reflection, or simply the most obedient son? In that thought lay poison. Not the venom of chaos, but of doubt. The first whisper that would one day become a roar. Yet even then, Horus remained loyal. He crushed doubt as he would any enemy. He told himself that faith demanded ignorance, that obedience was the price of love. When his brothers questioned their father's absence, and Magnus Fulgrim, even Perturabo, Horus defended him fiercely. "You do not understand," he said once to Lorgar. Our father's silence is purpose, not neglect. When he is ready, he will speak again. The words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Months turned to years. The crusade expanded without the Emperor's guiding presence. Horus became legend. His victories shaped not only the Imperium's borders but its belief. To many, he was the Emperor in motion, divine will made flesh. Worlds built shrines not to the golden throne, but to the War Master's banner. When the ecclesiarchy of later ages burned those monuments, they found beneath each one the same inscription, etched in quiet defiance. He led as gods should, among us. Even then, the Emperor saw it. On Terra, deep within the vaults beneath the palace, he felt the first tremors of change. He knew pride when he heard it whispered across the warp, but he did not intervene. For his work demanded isolation. The secret project that would one day define mankind's future could not be interrupted, not even for love. He believed Horus strong enough to endure the silence. He believed the bond between them was unbreakable, and that belief more than any enemy would destroy them both. Far from Terra, Horus dreamt of his father often. In those dreams, the Emperor stood before him in robes of gold, his eyes hidden behind light too bright to bear. Horus would kneel, as he always had, and ask, "What do you see in me now?" But the Emperor never answered. The dreams ended always the same way. Horus waking with his fist clenched, the echo of his father's voice replaced by the whisper of something colder, something waiting for him to stop believing. And when at last that whisper found words, it spoke not from the stars or the warp, but from within his own heart. He sees only himself in you. You will never be anything more. The title of War Master was meant to unite the Imperium. It did, but only for a moment. Beneath the banners of conquest, beneath the fanfare of victory and loyalty, something quieter was beginning to fracture. The Emperor's silence was a void no one could fill, and into that void poured voices, whispers of ambition, envy, and faith. Horus had become the Emperor's reflection in all but name, and for men who could not see the difference, reflection became replacement. In the early years of his command, Horus carried the burden with pride. He led the legions with precision that bordered on artistry. His charisma bridged rivalries that even the Emperor's authority could not quell. When the word-bearers faltered, Horus guided them with patience. When the Iron Warriors raged, he steadied them with discipline. Every victory expanded not only the Imperium's reach but the shadow of his own legend. The other Primarchs began to measure themselves against him, and found themselves wanting. It was not jealousy alone that grew among them, but a kind of dread. For if Horus stood closest to their father, where did that leave the rest? Among mortals, the myth of the Emperor and his chosen son began to take shape. To the common soldier, it was not the man of gold on distant Terra who led them into battle, but the War Master who bled beside them. Priests in the compliance worlds began to merge the two figures into one. Horus Ascendant, they called him, the living arm of divine will. The administratum suppressed such language where it could, but the sentiment spread faster than fire. Men will always worship what they can see. The Emperor's silence stretched on. No word from Terra, no message of pride or admonishment, only directives mechanical and cold. The sigillite, Malkador, sent them in his stead, his tone diplomatic but unyielding. "You are trusted," his messages said. "Do not fail the vision." Yet each word was a knife disguised as praise. Horus began to understand that trust was a leash in golden form, beautiful but binding. The Great Crusade reached its zenith. Horus stood at its center, a figure of impossible composure. His armor shone like obsidian beneath the banners of the Luna Wolves, his voice commanding not only obedience but devotion. When he spoke, entire worlds listened. When he smiled, armies believed. Yet in the quiet between campaigns, when the fleet sailed through the dark between stars, Horus would find himself alone in his quarters, the weight of his father's absence pressing like gravity on his chest. He turned to his brothers for solace, but even they could not pierce the growing distance. Fulgrim saw only ambition reflected back. Perturabo saw strategy. Sanguinius saw sorrow. Only Magnus the Red came close to truth. "You have begun to see the Emperor as he truly is," Magnus told him once, their minds meeting through psychic communion. "A being of infinite purpose and therefore infinite distance. Love and coldness in equal measure." Horus laughed bitterly. "You make him sound like a machine." Magnus replied. Perhaps he must be. Horus could not accept that. To him, the Emperor was still flesh and thought, still a father who had once smiled at him in the dark. To admit otherwise would mean that every sacrifice made in his name had been for an idea, not a man. And ideas cannot love you back. The first fissures appeared during the Crusades' council meetings. Disagreements once settled by reason became contests of pride. The Primarchs argued not about conquest but meaning. What was humanity's destiny? Was it enlightenment as Magnus believed? Strength as Russ demanded? Or unity as Horus declared? The Emperor had never answered those questions outright, and now that he was gone, each son claimed a fragment of his intent. Horus began to realize the truth, that perhaps none of them had ever truly understood their father's vision. Perhaps the Emperor had never meant for them to. When word came, from Terra, that the Emperor had withdrawn entirely from the Great Crusade to focus on his secret, Imperial Webway project, confusion became resentment. To the legions it looked like abandonment. To Horus it felt like betrayal. The man who had taught him that faith was weakness had now demanded it of him without explanation. He stood before his captains aboard the Vengeful Spirit, the bridge bathed in red lumen light. He builds a new world and leaves us to clean the bones of the old, Horus said. We are to be the shadow that upholds his light. But even the brightest light burns blind. None spoke. None needed to. The truth was already known but never voiced. The Emperor's silence had become unbearable. It was not the warp, not chaos, not alien lies that first turned the War Master's heart. It was loneliness. In his private chamber, Horus kept a hollow of Terra, not as it was, but as he imagined it, radiant beneath eternal day. He would look upon it and whisper as though speaking to his father, "Do you still see me out here in the dark?" The hollow never answered. The stars never flickered. But somewhere deep within the warp, something listened. Something that had been waiting since the beginning of time for gods to grow tired of their own silence. And when it finally spoke, it did not come as an enemy's voice. It came as a friend's, familiar, gentle. It said, "He has forgotten you." It began as a whisper, no louder than breath, no clearer than memory. It spoke not through the ears but through the soul, weaving itself into the rhythm of thought. For Horus it was not foreign. It sounded like his father's voice. That was why he listened. In the darkness between campaigns aboard the Vengeful Spirit, Horus had begun to dream. Dreams of Terra as it once was, green, unbroken, untouched by the iron of progress. The Emperor walked beside him across fields of gold, his armor absent, his face human. In those dreams he smiled the same way he had on Chthoniya when they first met. "My son," the Emperor said, "you have done what I could not. You have built the Imperium not from command but from belief." Horus knelt, overwhelmed. "Then why have you left us?" he asked. The Emperor reached to touch his shoulder, but his hand passed through him like smoke. "Because you are ready to rule," he whispered, "and I am tired." When Horus awoke, he was trembling. The words haunted him like scripture half remembered. In his waking hours he told himself it was imagination, a conjuration of exhaustion. But the voice persisted, soft, patient, shaping itself around his own doubts. "You have been abandoned, Horus. You were made to be loved, but not to be trusted. He fears what you might become if you surpass him." At first, Horus resisted. He turned to his brothers for reassurance. Sanguinius, ever the voice of hope, told him that the Emperor's distance was necessity, not neglect. "He carries burdens we cannot," Sanguinius said. "Would you wish them for yourself?" Horus smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. "I would bear anything," he said quietly, "if it meant standing beside him again." But the Emperor did not return. The silence deepened, and the whisper, now shaped into thought, began to sound like reason. It was during the campaign on Davin that everything changed. The planet was a wasteland, a decaying world steeped in superstition and rot. A rebellion had festered there, led by a former imperial governor who once swore loyalty to Horus himself. The betrayal stung deeper than it should have because it mirrored something he had not yet admitted. Even loyalty could curdle when ignored. The War Master led the assault personally, descending through the toxic atmosphere in gleaming armor, his every movement a sermon of control. Yet in the ruins of Davin's cities, the ground itself seemed to breathe. The air shimmered like heat, but the heat came from within the stone, as if the world was alive and watching. When the traitor governor was finally cornered, he did not plead. He laughed. "Even you, my lord, serve something you do not understand," the man said before the execution. Horus struck him down with his own hand. The blade he used, a relic gifted by one of his Mechanicum allies, drank the man's blood like water. Moments later, Horus fell. The wound was small, but the corruption ran deep. Within hours, fever claimed him. His heart stilled. His warriors, panicked and desperate, carried him to the planet's temple in search of healing. They did not know the temple was a gate. What happened inside is recorded differently by every witness. Some say the priests of Davin summoned sorcery to restore him. Others say the War Master's soul was taken into the warp itself. But Horus remembered it as a dream, a perfect dream. He stood in a chamber of light that pulsed with living gold. Before him stood the Emperor, radiant and solemn. "You have done well, my son," he said. "Better than I imagined." Horus fell to his knees. "Then why?" he demanded. "Why do you hide from me? Why do you leave me in the dark?" The Emperor's expression softened. "Because I must. Because you were not meant to serve, but to succeed." Behind him, the light shifted, forming shapes. Faces Horus recognized. The other Primarchs. Each turned away from him. "They will never understand," the Emperor said. "They will always see you as less, but I see what you truly are. The Imperium does not need me, it needs you." The warmth of the words was unbearable. Horus felt the truth sink into him like fire through ice. "If that is so," he whispered, "then why do you still command?" The Emperor stepped closer, his form dissolving into shadow. "Then take what is already yours." When Horus awoke, the fever was gone. The wound had healed. His eyes burned with a light that frightened even his captains. He spoke little of what he had seen, but from that moment the man who rose from the temple was not the same who had entered it. He looked upon the stars and no longer saw them as his father's domain. He saw them as inheritance. On the return to the fleet, he ordered a private council with his most trusted commanders, Erebus among them, the priest of the word-bearers whose faith had long walked the edge of heresy. Erebus spoke with quiet conviction, framing the Emperor not as savior but usurper, a tyrant who had stolen divinity from humanity and locked it behind a throne. Horus listened and for the first time did not argue. The logic was seductive because it justified what he already feared, that the Emperor's love had never been for him, but for the dream he could not share. That night, standing alone in his command sanctum, Horus activated the Hollow of Terra one last time. He stared at the golden world, at the flickering continents where billions prayed to the name of the man who had abandoned him. "You gave me everything," he said quietly, "and left me with nothing." The whisper answered, "Then take it back." The wound that changed the galaxy was no deeper than a blade's edge, a single incision on the War Master's flesh that refused to close. But the infection it carried did not come from steel or toxin. It came from revelation, from the simple, unbearable thought that love could be a lie. When Horus returned from the temple on Davin, his men saw a resurrection. They hailed it as a miracle. They saw their War Master rise from death, healed and radiant, and knew no human could ever match him. Yet those who looked closer, those who dared, saw something else. His eyes had changed. The light within them was no longer reflection. It was creation. Horus no longer looked at the stars as a servant of light, but as their master. In the days that followed, he spoke to no one. He remained in the strategium of the vengeful spirit, surrounded by the ghostly glow of battle maps and campaign reports. The silence there was almost holy. Then one night he summoned his captains. They entered cautiously, Aximand, Loken, Abaddon, men who had followed him across 10,000 worlds. Horus stood before them unarmored, the scar of his healing a faint silver mark above his heart. "Brothers," he said, "I have seen the truth." The words fell like lead. "The Emperor," he continued, "is not what we were told. He is no god. He is a man who fears us, fears what we might become if we surpass him." Loken stepped forward, his voice tight. "My lord, that is blasphemy." Horus smiled. "Is it? Or is it faith, the kind our father himself preached when he told us to believe only in mankind?" Abaddon's eyes flickered with something darker than belief. "What did you see on Davin, my War Master?" he asked. Horus's answer was soft, almost tender. "Freedom." They left that chamber as loyal sons and returned as something else. Not heretics yet, but believers in a new kind of truth. Erebus had already begun his work among them, spreading the creed of the gods that waited beyond sight. He did not speak of chaos as corruption, but as potential. The Emperor would have you kneel before a throne, Erebus said, but there are powers who would see you stand beside them. Horus listened, not because he believed, but because he wanted to. The gods did not demand obedience. They offered choice. And for a man raised under perfection, choice felt like air after drowning. Yet the part of Horus that still remembered his father's smile resisted. In his dreams he saw the Emperor again, but no longer as comfort. The light around him had grown harsher, the gold fading to white so bright it burned. "You would betray me?" the Emperor asked, though his lips did not move. "You gave me nothing to keep," Horus answered. "You made me in your image and called me son, but you never let me be your equal." The Emperor's face did not change. "I made you to lead, not to rule." Horus woke screaming. Across the fleet the warp currents shifted. Astropaths reported distortions in the Astronomican signal. The navigators spoke of hearing whispers beneath the hum of the psychic beacon, voices that called themselves by names older than the stars. Wherever the vengeful spirit went, the warp rippled as though in recognition. The gods had found their vessel. On Davin, the cult that had tended Horus's wound spread its gospel. They built altars of bone and iron in his name, proclaiming him the liberator of chains. Their prayers carried through the warp like scent through flame, feeding on the devotion of every soldier who doubted the Emperor's perfection. The corruption did not come as a flood, but as a tide. It rose quietly, gently, so that no one noticed they were drowning until they tried to breathe. And yet even then, Horus believed he was saving humanity. He told himself the Emperor's tyranny had to be broken for mankind to ascend. "He would have us crawl in the light," he said to his captains. "I will teach us to walk in the dark." Those words became the seed of rebellion. They spread from ship to ship, legion to legion, disguised as reason, armored in conviction. When they reached the word-bearers, the Alpha Legion, the Night Lords, the sons who already doubted, belief became contagion. Still, there were those who loved him. Garviel Loken, ever loyal, confronted his commander in private. "You are not yourself," he said. "Whatever you saw, whatever touched you, it is not our Father's will." Horus's gaze softened. "Our Father's will?" he repeated. "Tell me, Loken, when has he ever asked what ours might be?" Loken's silence was answer enough. The War Master turned away. "You will see the truth soon. When the Emperor finally looks upon us, he will understand." But the Emperor already knew. On Terra, deep within the chambers of the Golden Throne, he felt the first fracture through the warp, not as sound but as pain. It was not Horus's rebellion that struck him. It was his belief that he could no longer be loved. That was the moment the Emperor's vision faltered. He had seen countless futures, countless betrayals, but not this. Not the betrayal of the one soul in all creation he had thought incorruptible. And in that blindness, the fate of humanity began to turn. Not toward destruction, but toward understanding. The cruel understanding that love, when stretched across galaxies, becomes indistinguishable from faith. The infection did not spread like sickness. It spread like faith, quietly, patiently, with conviction disguised as enlightenment. Every conversation aboard the vengeful spirit became a sermon. Every doubt a revelation. The men who had once sworn oaths to the Emperor now swore them to the War Master, though they told themselves it was the same thing. The line between loyalty and worship vanished the way all lines do, slowly, then all at once. Horus no longer needed to convince anyone. The aura around him did the work. There was something in his presence now, something that bent reality's edges as though gravity itself had learned reverence. His words carried weight beyond command. When he spoke of freedom, even cynics believed. When he condemned the Emperor's silence, even loyal hearts faltered. It was not charisma. It was revelation in human form. He had become what the Emperor feared most, a god who believed himself justified. In the warp, the gods watched with the hunger of predators circling prey. But they did not speak to him directly. They understood that the most perfect corruption is the one that still calls itself righteousness. So they let Horus believe that his rebellion was mercy, that his defiance was justice, that in freeing mankind from his Father's will, he was fulfilling the very dream that created him. Still, there were cracks. In rare moments of solitude, when the warship's hum quieted to near silence, Horus felt it. The wound within him, not healed but waiting. It pulsed faintly beneath his armor like a second heartbeat. Sometimes it whispered, not in the voices of gods or demons, but in his own. He trusted you because he saw himself in you, and that is why he must fall. Horus would stare into the mirror of his armor and see both father and son reflected in one face, gold and gray, light and shadow. He no longer knew which he hated more. The campaign on Istvan Fee was his masterpiece and in his confession. Officially, it was to crush a rebellion. In truth, it was to begin one. Horus gathered his brothers, Ongren, Fulgrim, Mortarion, and Perturabo, under the pretense of unity. Together, they would purge the loyalists who misinterpreted the Emperor's will. He spoke with fire and sorrow, his words crafted like scripture. The Emperor chained us with perfection. I will break those chains. I will show him that mankind does not need a master, only a leader. And they followed him. Not because they believed in his cause, but because they believed in him. The loyalist legions landed first. They died believing they were fighting for truth. When Horus ordered the bombardment, he did not watch the explosions. He closed his eyes. He imagined his father's face as each detonation tore through the soil. Imagined the Emperor finally understanding what he had created. When the ash settled, Horus opened his eyes to a sky burning red with betrayal. He felt no joy, no regret, only inevitability. It was not hatred that guided his hand, but clarity. For the first time he understood his father completely. The Emperor had loved humanity too much to rule it. Horus loved it too little to let it remain unruled. From that day, the wound within him stopped bleeding. It began to sing. The song was not melody but resonance, the pulse of the warp itself aligning with his will. The gods called it blessing. Horus called it understanding. His fleet spread across the stars like wildfire. Each world that fell to his banner echoed his new creed. The Emperor made us to serve. The War Master made us to choose. The Imperium split down the middle, not between loyal and traitor, but between faiths, two visions of salvation, each convinced of its purity. On Terra, the Emperor watched the flames spread through the void. He said nothing, not to his custodies, not to his council, not even to himself. He knew that words once spoken could no longer be unsaid, and that this silence, like all silences, would cost him everything. Perhaps he could still have stopped it. Perhaps he could have reached out through the warp and touched his son's mind one last time. But he didn't, because he had already seen the ending. And in that ending, there was only one truth. Horus would rise and then fall, and from his fall would come the faith that would keep humanity alive for the next 10,000 years. The Emperor did not stop Horus because, in some impossible, terrible way, he knew that he could not save mankind without first losing himself, and the son who mirrored him most. So he allowed it. He allowed the galaxy to burn. He allowed his dream to die, because he saw in Horus what he had always seen, the reflection of what he had to destroy to become what the Imperium needed. The whispering wound had done its work. It had taught both God and son that love is not the absence of betrayal. It is the reason betrayal hurts enough to shape eternity. The Emperor did not speak, not when the first worlds declared for Horus, not when the fleets of the War Master turned their guns on those still loyal, not when the skies of the Imperium, once silver with victory, burned black with civil war. He had foreseen this. Every fracture, every scream, every moment when love would become execution, and still he remained silent. For the Emperor's burden was not ignorance, it was knowledge. He understood that to save humanity, he could not save his son. Deep beneath the surface of Terra, the golden throne thrummed like a heart made of fire. The air shimmered with psychic energy, the scent of oil and sanctified ash heavy in the vaults. Here, far below the storms that cloaked the Himalayan peaks, the Emperor worked alone. Around him, the custodes stood in absolute stillness, living statues whose vigilance bordered on worship. The Sisters of Silence walked among them, their presence a vacuum of sound. In this subterranean sanctum, the Emperor constructed humanity's last refuge, the Imperial Webway, a door that would lead mankind beyond the reach of the warp's corruption. Every thought, every breath was devoted to that singular task, but even gods are haunted by memory. When he closed his eyes, he saw Horus as he once was, a boy of iron pride and impossible faith, laughing amid the ruins of Chthoniya, sunlight glinting on armor that had not yet tasted betrayal. He remembered the first campaign they had fought together, the first time he had felt something close to joy since the dawn of creation. Horus had not been perfect. He had never wanted him to be. Perfection was sterile, lifeless. Horus had been alive, brilliant, unafraid to question. And now that same spark had become a wildfire consuming the stars. Reports flooded in, worlds falling, legions turning, brothers slaughtering brothers. The custodes knelt before him, their voices steady but their eyes pleading for command. The Emperor gave none. His silence was both shield and sentence. Every order spoken aloud risked breaking the web of destiny he had woven. Every word carried the weight of 1,000 futures, and he had already seen them all, everyone ending in fire. To act too soon would mean the end of mankind. To wait meant losing his son forever. It was not indecision that chained his tongue. It was understanding. There are moments even for gods when knowledge becomes a kind of paralysis. Malkador, ever loyal, stood at his side, bearing the burden of speech in his place. "They call you absent," the sigillite said quietly. "They say the throne consumes you." The Emperor's eyes, twin suns beneath the weight of eternity, flickered. "They are not wrong." "Then speak to them," Malkador urged. "Speak to him. If he hears your voice, he might remember." The Emperor looked into the shadows where the air itself trembled under his will. "He must forget me," he said. "Only then will he understand why I made him." Malkador bowed his head. "You are a poor father, my lord. I was never meant to be one." Above them, the galaxy burned. The reports from Istvan reached Terra. The massacre, the betrayal, the cries of those who had trusted their war master until the last moment. The Emperor read the transmissions without expression. For all his foresight, the pain still cut through the armor of omniscience. Even gods bleed in their own way. He placed a single hand upon the data slate and the machine's spirit fell silent. "It begins," he said. There were moments when even the custodes faltered before his silence. To them he was the Emperor, radiant, omnipotent, absolute. But in those quiet hours beneath the palace, when the light of his throne dimmed to a faint gold, they could see the weariness in his form, the lines of humanity that eternity had not yet erased. He was not the god they would one day proclaim. He was a man who had seen too much and loved too deeply to speak. His silence was not distance. It was mourning. Outside, the Mechanicus of Mars declared for Horus. The red planet's forges turned their prayers toward the War Master, and ships once built in service to the Emperor now carried his destruction. The flames of rebellion spread faster than light, consuming loyalty itself. Every world that fell made the Emperor's silence heavier, not with guilt but with acceptance. He had known from the beginning that his vision could only survive through loss. The Imperium, as he had built it, was a weapon too heavy for mercy. And still he did not call for Horus. He did not summon his son to account, nor send emissaries to reason or threaten. To speak now would be to change what must occur. The Emperor's silence became the anvil upon which destiny was hammered. Each death, each burning world was a toll paid for a future he would never live to see. In the warp, the gods screamed their triumph. They believed they had unmade him. They did not understand that the Emperor's greatest weapon was not his power, but his restraint. He knew the moment he spoke, the universe would shatter, for his words were creation itself. So he endured. He let the storm rage. He watched his empire tear itself apart, because he had seen the truth no mortal could bear, that only through the ruin of his dream could humanity learn to survive without gods. He had made Horus to be the proof of that truth. And Horus, in his fall, would become it. The storm finally reached Terra, the homeworld of mankind, radiant and inviolable for 200 centuries, became a citadel of despair. The sky burned gold with the light of the Astronomican, yet beneath it the planet trembled under the echo of war. Fleets of loyalists poured into the segmentum solar, hunted by their own brothers. Every transmission, every plea for guidance reached the palace and fell unanswered. The Emperor's silence was complete. But within that silence he was speaking, not to men, not to armies, but to the fabric of existence itself. The Imperial Webway project consumed him. The great machinery of the Golden Throne groaned with psychic tension, the sound of reality bending to his will. He did not eat. He did not rest. His form shimmered between flesh and light as he fought not an enemy, but inevitability. His consciousness extended beyond the vaults, threading through the labyrinthine corridors of the webway, closing breaches, restraining the warp with the force of a single perfect thought. The custodes who watched him could not comprehend the scale of the war he waged. His enemy was not Horus, it was the warp itself. It was the gods who would one day feed upon mankind's despair. He was sealing the gate that would keep them forever hungry, yet even as he labored, he could not banish the image of his son. Horus haunted him like the echo of laughter in an empty hall. Every pulse of psychic energy carried traces of memory, moments when they had stood together, when Horus had called him father not as title, but as truth. Now that word had been replaced by another, tyrant. The Emperor heard it carried on the winds of rebellion across 1,000 worlds. He let it stand. He knew that myth must become monstrous before it could endure. If mankind was to survive, it could not worship the father who failed it. It had to revere the god who sacrificed everything, and so he allowed himself to be hated. Malkador stood at his side until his body began to wither from proximity to the throne's radiance. Even then he refused to leave. "He is coming," Malkador said one night, his voice shaking. "Horus gathers the traitor legions. They will reach Terra within the year." The Emperor's eyes opened. In them burned the calm of inevitability. "He will come," he said. "Because he must." "Then you will face him?" Malkador asked. The Emperor looked to the throne, the machinery that bound his will, the cage that ensured humanity's freedom. "When the time comes," he said softly, "I will do what must be done." "But not before." Malkador's expression darkened. "You could have saved him." "No," the Emperor replied. "He was made to prove that gods cannot." Outside, the loyalists rallied. Rogel Dorn fortified the palace with silent fury. Sanguinius prayed without faith. Guilliman, far away, built empires of reason while the Imperium fell to ruin. Each Primarch responded to their father's silence in their own way. Some with defiance, some with devotion. But none understood its purpose. They saw only absence where he had placed restraint. They mistook his stillness for pride, his patience for indifference. They did not realize that every second he bought through inaction was one more heartbeat for humanity. The Emperor's silence was not abandonment. It was sacrifice, then came the final vision. While bound to the throne, his mind drifted beyond time. In the shimmering void of the warp, he saw the reflection of all that would come. The siege of Terra, the fall of the palace, the death of his chosen son beneath his own hand. He saw the endless future that would follow, a galaxy worshipping a corpse, 1,000 years of superstition born from his own failure to be understood. He saw the ecclesiarchy burning worlds in his name, the Inquisition hunting truth as blasphemy, the Mechanicus venerating him as the machine god. He saw the horror of his own apotheosis, and still, he did not turn away. Because in that vision he saw one more thing, a single spark that endured beneath it all. Humanity still alive, still struggling, still reaching for light, even when that light was illusion. He understood then what Horus never could, that love and control are mortal enemies. To free mankind, he had to let it make gods of its own mistakes. When he woke, the throne pulsed brighter than ever before. "It is time," he said. His voice was not command but confession. The webway would not hold. The gates trembled under the pressure of 1,000,000 screaming demons. He could no longer maintain both the barrier and the silence. One would have to break, so he chose. He diverted the last of his will toward the beacon of the Astronomican, the flame that would guide humanity through the void. The webway collapsed, but the light remained. The throne devoured him. The Emperor became the machine that preserved his species, and in that transformation, he fell silent once more. Far away, aboard the vengeful spirit, Horus felt it. The connection between father and son that had bound them since the beginning, the echo of their shared creation, shuddered as the Emperor's presence dimmed. For a heartbeat, Horus felt his father's exhaustion, his grief, his final unspoken love. He mistook it for weakness. He mistook mercy for surrender. And so he set his course for Terra. The siege had begun. The silence was over. And in that breaking of silence, the Emperor's true voice would finally be heard. Not in words, but in the ruin of everything he had built. The sky above Terra was a wound. Ships burned like falling stars, their wreckage streaking across the atmosphere as the traitor legions descended upon the cradle of mankind. The siege had begun, a war not of worlds but of faith. Every fortress became a shrine, every act of defiance a prayer. The walls of the imperial palace shook under the bombardment of the War Master's fleets, and still, the banners of the Aquila did not fall. Because they could not. To lower them would be to admit that gods could die. In the darkened sanctum beneath the palace, the emperor sat upon the throne, his body immobile, his mind vast. The machinery around him howled with the strain of eternity. Energy bled from every conduit, burning gold against the shadows. His consciousness was no longer bound by flesh. It extended across the planet into the void, touching every soul that still dared to believe. He felt them all. The fear of soldiers on the battlements, the rage of custodes in the corridors, the prayers of civilians huddled beneath the catacombs. Every voice rose to him in desperation, and though he could not answer, he heard them. His silence was no longer distance. It was presence. On the walls of the palace, Rogaldorn stood like a statue carved from grief. Around him, the sons of the emperor fought and died without hesitation. The traitor legions had landed in force, the world eaters screaming through the smoke, the death guard spreading plague through the air, the sons of Horus advancing like a tidal wave of gunmetal and fury. Each legion carried the face of betrayal. Each one was a reflection of love turned into hatred. And behind them all, aboard his flagship in orbit, the War Master watched, silent as his father once had been. Horus did not lead from the front that day. He commanded from afar, not out of cowardice but restraint. He wanted his father to come to him. He needed it. For all his power, all his faith, all his newfound divinity, Horus could not escape the one truth that haunted him. Everything he was still belonged to the Emperor, and until his father acknowledged that, until he saw him again, the rebellion would remain unfinished. The war dragged on for months that felt like centuries. The palace became a labyrinth of ruin, blood mixed with sacred oil. The air was thick with ash and the smell of burning incense. The sound of bolter fire was indistinguishable from the chanting of prayers. And yet through it all the Emperor remained silent. Some said he no longer lived. Others said he was waiting. Only Malkador knew the truth. The Emperor's consciousness had gone deeper, past the warp, past time itself, searching for the only mind that had ever truly mirrored his own. He was searching for Horus. When he found him, it was not in space or on any battlefield. It was within the warp, the realm that had birthed their bond and now sought to destroy it. There, amid oceans of screaming souls and suns made of thought, the Emperor beheld his son once more. Horus stood radiant in armor that shone with the favor of gods. Behind him towered shapes beyond comprehension, forms that twisted between beauty and horror. "Father," Horus said, his voice echoing across the immaterial. "At last you look upon me. Tell me, what do you see?" The Emperor's presence unfolded like dawn. He spoke not in words, but in thought so vast it filled the void. "I see what I made, and what I failed to unmake." Horus smiled, though the expression trembled. "You made me to love you and then punished me for it. You taught me to doubt gods and yet demanded that I worship you. I am only what you wanted." The Emperor's thought cut through the storm. "No, you are what I hoped." "Hope?" Horus's laughter became a snarl. "You call this hope? You abandoned me. You abandoned all of us. I gave you freedom, you gave me silence." Horus roared. The warp shuddered. "You watched as I fell. You let me fall." "Because you had to." The Emperor's mind reached toward him, not to strike but to touch. The gesture was the same one he had made on Chthoniya, when he first found the boy who would become the War Master. "I saw in you," he said aloud now, the voice of creation itself, "what I could never see in myself. Love without limit, belief without fear. You were my proof that humanity was worth saving." Horus faltered. The gods behind him hissed, their forms writhing like serpents in pain. "Then why destroy me?" "Because you are the part of me that I cannot allow to live." For a moment there was silence, pure, unbearable silence. Then the vision broke. The Emperor opened his eyes. The throne's machinery screamed. The last of his strength was fading, but the moment had come. He knew where Horus waited, aboard the vengeful spirit orbiting Terra like a vulture over its own corpse. The time for silence was over. He rose from the throne. The custodies fell to their knees, blinded by the light that poured from his form. The air crackled with the sound of 1,000 souls whispering his name. The Emperor took up his sword, a blade that shimmered with the radiance of 10,000 suns, and spoke for the first time in months. "My sons," he said, "the end is near. Guard what remains. I go to finish what began with love." And with that, he vanished in a burst of golden fire. The vengeful spirit hung above Terra like a moon of ruin. Its hull burned with the reflected fire of the planet below, each scar and fracture glowing like scripture written in pain. Inside the corridors were silent. The laughter of demons had faded. The whispers had withdrawn. All that remained was expectation, the moment before confession. Horus waited in the strategium, his armor polished to a sheen that caught the light of distant flame. Around him lay the broken bodies of the Emperor's chosen, the last of the boarding custods, their golden armor dulled by soot and blood. He had slaughtered them with a precision that bordered on reverence. They were not enemies, not truly. They were the final witnesses to his ascension. And when the Emperor appeared in the doorway, bathed in radiance that bent the shadows toward him, Horus smiled. "At last," he said. "You came." The Emperor stepped forward, and the deck plates beneath his feet began to glow. The demons that had lingered in the corners screamed and fled. In his presence, their existence unraveled. "My son," he said softly, "why have you done this?" Horus's voice was calm. "Because I loved you. Because I believed in you more than you believed in yourself. You made me in your image, then punished me for seeing what you truly are, a man who wanted to be a god and could not bear the sight of his reflection." The Emperor's eyes shone like twin stars. "No, I made you to lead humanity beyond gods, to build a world where love did not require worship." "Then you failed," Horus said. He spread his arms, encompassing the burning galaxy beyond the ship's viewport. "Look at what they've become. They kneel to you already. They will keep kneeling for 10,000 years, feeding on your silence. You made them need you, Father. You made them need me." For the first time, the Emperor's expression wavered. Not in anger, in grief. "Yes," he said quietly. "That is my sin." They circled each other like planets locked in orbit. The air hummed with energy, the warp and the material world merging until time itself seemed to pause. When their blades met, the sound was not metal upon metal, but truth striking truth. Each blow shattered more than steel. It tore at the fabric of what they had been. The Emperor's sword blazed with light that purified the dark. Horus's weapon burned with darkness that devoured the light. Father and son, creator and creation, faith and freedom, each was the reflection of the other, and each knew that only one could remain. Outside the ship, the war slowed. Across Terra, warriors on both sides felt something pass through them, a wave of sorrow so pure that even hatred faltered. Sanguinius, broken upon the deck of the same ship moments before, had seen what Horus had become. He had whispered a warning before dying: he cannot be saved. And still the Emperor had come. Not to destroy, to understand. The duel raged through the corridors, through memory and matter alike. Every strike from Horus carried the weight of every unanswered question. Every parry from the Emperor was a prayer unspoken. "Why won't you fight me?" Horus demanded, his voice cracking beneath the armor of wrath. "Do you pity me?" "I love you," the Emperor said. The words struck harder than any blade. Horus faltered. For an instant, the gods that whispered through his veins recoiled, shrieking at the weakness that threatened to undo them. And in that instant, Horus truly saw his father. Not the Emperor of mankind, not the god of the Imperium, but the man who had once smiled at a child born from the stars. The realization came too late. The demons howled through him, forcing his body forward. He struck one final time, and the Emperor caught the blade in his hand. Blood, golden, radiant, endless, spilled across the floor. Yet the Emperor did not cry out. He simply whispered, "My son." Then the light consumed them both. When it faded, Horus lay dying. The darkness had fled him, leaving only the human beneath. The pride, the fury, the divinity might all burned away until only sorrow remained. He looked up at the father he had betrayed and whispered, "I wanted you to see me." The Emperor knelt beside him. "I always did," he said. And with that, he placed his hand upon Horus's brow and ended his life, not in vengeance but in mercy. The gods screamed as their chosen vessel was unmade. The vengeful spirit trembled. The warp itself recoiled, and for the first time in an age, the demons fell silent. When the loyalists boarded the ship hours later, they found only ruin. The War Master's body was gone, reduced to ash that glowed faintly with light. The Emperor was barely alive, his form broken, his power spent. Dorn carried him back to Terra, weeping as even demigods weep. Upon the golden throne, the Emperor's final breath became the Astronomican, the light that would guide humanity through endless darkness. And in that moment, the Emperor saw all things. He saw the future that would come, an Imperium built not upon truth but upon memory, worshipping his silence as though it were command. He saw his name turned into prayer and his image into tyranny. But he also saw the ember that would endure, humanity still fighting, still hoping, still refusing to die. That was what he had always seen in Horus. That was what he had loved, not obedience. Not perfection, defiance. The Emperor's eyes closed. His voice, fading to a whisper, carried one last thought into the void. I made you to be free, and then he was silent. The silence that followed has lasted 10,000 years. But it is not emptiness. It is the sound of endurance, the echo of a father's final vision and a son's final lesson. The Emperor does not speak because he no longer needs to. Everything he ever saw in Horus he now sees in us. The Imperium lives. And in the endless dark between stars, the silence still watches.